If you're watching this video, you're probably into damage per screenshot memes. You don't care about sustainable damage, you just want to hit things hard. I get it, you're built different. Well, it's time to ignore the meta, and just in time for the release of Snow White, let's go over what the OG version has to offer, and explore what this always hungry glutton can do in terms of her infamous nuke ability. You guys voted this character in the last video, so here it is. My name is Psyche, and let's get started with my guide and analysis on Snow White. We'll start by giving Snow White an overview. This section is mainly here to prepare you into what you're getting yourself into, as Snow White is definitely not gonna be everyone's cup of tea. I'm gonna go over the strengths and weaknesses of playing her, then let you decide for yourself if you want to commit to the build. She's a weird one for sure. While the majority of DPS units offer sustained damage that's consistent over time, Snow White just says, screw all that, we're banking everything on one shot. Her signature burst is one that's somewhat similar to Maxwell's charged up laser beam, but to a much more extreme extent. When fully charged up, Snow White will fire a nuke-like projectile that has a piercing effect with a wide AoE and dealing massive damage. Now, to preface this video, Snow White is one of the few units that I didn't have built up, since her gameplay just seemed too different for my liking. Even now, I certainly would not consider myself as an expert Snow White player. There's definitely going to be some small details I miss here and there. And since there's relatively little updated information online, it's kinda hard to explore all the ways you can play her without doing some troubleshooting on my own. One of Snow White's major strengths is her ability to one-shot bosses in campaign stages and some special interception bosses with enough investments and a bit of luck. One of her major advantages is being able to use off-meta characters like Miranda, Polly, and Yoha, which means with a Snow White setup, you can free up your meta units for other teams in raid content. On the other hand, playing Snow White also comes at a couple weaknesses. While the nuke itself is very powerful, it can depend on the boss that you're facing how much damage it will deal, so it is quite situational. Another disadvantage is that since you're banking everything on that one shot, if it doesn't hit the place you want it to, or you miss altogether, then you're gonna have to restart the stage. Not to mention, she greatly benefits from a high amount of investment, so while everyone can start using her from the beginning of the game, her usability increases later on. That's just some of the pros and cons of playing Snow White, and I'm sure more details will surface as I start explaining her kit and teams. So let's get started with that. I'm gonna go over Snow White's kit, and I think from this guide and onwards, I'm going to do the kit overview and its leveling priorities in one go, as I think it just makes more sense to do that. As always, I will be using my criteria for leveling skills as I have in my past guides. Skill 1 is a passive damage increase when certain conditions are met. By landing 30 attacks, she deals some more damage to the target and gains a small attack up for 5 seconds. This one gets a low priority. Because of how her burst works, it's pretty hard to synergize this with it. It's a slight bump in passive damage, but I don't see it as much more than that. Skill 2. This one's a bit more tricky. Every 15 seconds, Snow White will fire a rocket dealing AoE damage at a random target. Normally, I would just dismiss this as another source of passive damage, but there's a second part. Whenever attacking in full burst, she also gains a crit rate buff. Now, from what we learned with how damage is calculated in this game, critting usually doesn't really matter, but it kinda does in Snow White's case. It's usually ideal if the nuke crits. The wording here is confusing as always with the English translation. Let me break this down. The skill itself will only activate every 15 seconds, and this includes the crit rate up part. The problem here is that when Snow White uses her burst, she starts to charge up the nuke, meaning you can't activate the crit up unless she deals an instance of damage first. Then one way to get around this is to time her burst so that the missile hits something while she's charging up the nuke, which satisfies the condition for attacking during full burst. And then you get the crit up buff. The TLDR is that by timing the burst at every 15-second intervals, which you can check by just looking at the time remaining on the stage, the missile lands, which activates the crit up buff that can be seen below Snow White's portrait, then your nuke will have more likelihood of critting. The skill gets medium priority, mainly because that crit damage on the nuke is a general improvement versus if you didn't crit, and it doesn't hurt to invest in that consistency. Finally, we arrive at the best part. Snow White's burst is the signature part of her kit. The damage scaling from level 1 to 10 is absolutely insane. If you're committing to playing Snow White, you're gonna want to max this one out. Needless to say, the burst gets a high priority for leveling. Good for damage, not so good for your resources. When the burst skill is used, Snow White will change the weapon she's using temporarily to an anti-ship rifle shot that does high damage and pierces everything in its path. By default, it will have a charge up time of 5 seconds, and can be charged up to 1000%. Because of the scaling, you want to make sure that you're firing the shot when it reaches a full charge, as you would be losing damage if you didn't. I'll talk more about this in the gameplay section. For now, just level the burst as high as you can, preferably maxing out. Now we talk about gearing. Technically, Snow White can be used by any player at any stage of the game, as she already deals a decent amount of damage even without overload gear. But you guessed it, her true potentials are unlocked with overload gear and the right synergies. If you're waiting on Red Hood with the first anniversary, I would think twice before committing your pilgrim manufacturer gear for Snow White. While she's great as an off-meta option, Red Hood is anticipated to be very strong, and I will personally prioritize gear when she arrives. Nonetheless, if you have enough overload gear or you're just a Snow White super simp, let's take a look at what attributes are good. Now, looking at the tier list I've used previously, I'm not going to be putting anything on the must-have tier, as I don't think any stat in the game is essential for Snow White to perform well. On the tier below, I'm putting attack and charge speed. Since Snow White scales her nuke with attack, you want as much of it as possible. Charge speed, on the other hand, is good as it helps Snow White catch certain allies' buffs before they expire. If you didn't have any additional charge speed, because some Nikke's attack buffs last for 5 seconds, such as Leader and Novel, and if Snow White's charge up time is 5 seconds itself, then it will be impossible to catch those buffs when you fire the nuke. With a bit of charge speed overload lines and good timing, you can fire the shot with a 5 seconds buff barely just about to expire. While I don't think having charge speed lines are mandatory, it's certainly recommended as it opens up some team comps with Nikke's with 5-second buffs. Under that, we have crit rate and crit damage as decent lines, and I might as well throw in elemental damage on there too. Critting on the nuke is kinda important, so if you can maximize the damage from that, why not? Charge damage is better than nothing, and this is because charge damage scales additively, so it's barely an increase compared to the above stats. By elimination, max ammo count and hit rate don't matter, since the bulk of Snow White's damage comes from the nuke, and defense is defense. For cubes, you can go with the Adjutant or Onslaught. Because you don't really care about ammo capacity, the usual meta cubes don't exactly benefit from being placed on Snow White, which in some regards is actually good, because you now have a reason to use the other ones and free up those slots. Just keep in mind, even with the Adjutant or Onslaught, it's not going to be a big bump in damage. The max charge speed from the Adjutant is only just over 2% if it's level 7, and the charge damage from the Onslaught cube, as previously discussed, is barely an improvement over nothing, given how charge damage is scales in this game. I would go with either if you have lightning fast reflexes. Maybe you can use the Adjutant to fire off the nuke before any 5-second buffs expire. I personally wouldn't count on it. So I'm gonna combine the gameplay and teams section together, because this is where it gets interesting, and was the moment I started to respect Snow White as a unit as I started to play around with other Nikkes in my roster. While you can use your conventional meta buffers like Leader, Novel, Dorothy, the bunnies, and so on, what Snow White is able to do is that she can get away with using off-meta units instead. The reason is that most meta teams will have sustainable DPS, where it's important for all of your attackers to get buffed. Snow White teams want to front-load all the buffs onto herself, which means that Nikkes that normally don't get used often like Miranda, Polly, Yoha, start to look kinda good. For generalist options, Parvati gives a 10-second attack up upon full burst, the bunnies give it enemy damage taken debuff for 10 seconds, Christmas Ann, who is the one limited character that I don't have, also giving a big attack up for 10 seconds. All in all, since Snow White's nuke scales well with attack, you'll want as much of it as possible. And this is where your choice of teammates start to get interesting. One of the teams I tried out was a Miranda plus Polly comp. Coincidentally, they're from the same squad. But what this core specializes in is by dumping a large amount of attack ups for Snow White to benefit from. Miranda giving a monstrous 30 to 40% attack and crit damage up to the ally with the highest attack stat, and Polly giving another 30 to 40% attack up while also giving a bit of defense, all of which depending on the skill level of course. Given that Polly has a 40-second cooldown, running this core will give you the rare problem of needing another type 2. The last type 3 is flexible, though I will recommend putting at least one cooldown reduction unit in here. I ran Summer Helm as the second type 2. This is not ideal nor realistic for all players, but there weren't a lot of type 2s to pick from assuming all the meta picks are taken. The last type 3 slot is a bit tough. There's Prydwen for stalling the first burst rotations if you bring Snow White to campaign levels, so that the nuke gets reserved for the boss unit, Maxwell to increase charge speed and attack. There's another interesting choice with Yoha, of all people. She gives a huge attack up every 30 seconds. So if possible, ready the nuke when the timer reaches a 30-second interval. This was a team I decided to try out since I wanted to challenge myself and see how many off-meta units I can use. Of course, you also can't go wrong with the bunny comp, and if there's very little boss parts, you can even use the NikkeGG comp to aim for the core instead, though I would personally reserve them for an Alice team. Now, depending on your allies, when and where you aim your Snow White nuke will vary a little bit. Where she shines the most is where bosses have destroyable parts. Just like how Alice or Maxwell works, because of the Pierce mechanic, you get to double dip on damage if you hit multiple things at once. Snow White's nuke, however, can actually hit a wider range than you think. Ideally, if you can hit 3 or more things at once, it's really gonna help out at dishing out massive amounts of damage. Controlling the nuke itself is rather simple. Wait until intervals of 15 seconds before entering full burst. You should see skill 2 activating and the missile landing on an enemy to activate the crit up buff, then charge the shot up to 1000%. When firing, try to aim for a place where 1 or more weak points are nearby one another. Yes, this means that bosses that don't have overlapping parts might not be very effective against. Given that most of your damage hinges on this one shot, if the shot doesn't end up in the way you want, then you might want to restart the level and try again. If you're running Snow White in campaign stages, charge up the shot and wait for the boss to appear before blasting it. Even with a power deficiency of around 20 to 30k, you can usually one-shot the boss unit. For bosses specifically, what some people like to do is a strategy called crit fishing, because it's kind of a big difference if the nuke crits or not. Some players will keep restarting the level until they get a run where most or all of the nukes crit. This is a little extreme, but if you really want to embrace the damage per screenshot memes, you know what to do. Let's show an example of a run I did with Snow White earlier. In the current Union raid, the heavy metal boss seemed like a perfect fit for a Snow White team, given that it has many parts that are close together. I decided to try out the Miranda plus Poly core, with Summer Helm as a CDR unit. And from that shot, we can see that Snow White did a whopping 67 million damage.
That's quite big.
Now sure, this team wiped before the timer was up, but just from 3 bursts, the total damage came to the low 200 million mark, which admittedly is slightly lower than my other main teams, but keep in mind this is considering that I'm using no meta units and still being able to get numbers this high. That's pretty impressive. I also tried using the NikkeGG comp with Yoha as the other type 3. This team, as you might imagine, is very effective at keeping you alive, and what I did is that I tried to time Snow White's nukes at every 30-second intervals, where Yoha's huge damage buff kicks in, then I let it rip. From a boss where I primarily tried to target the core instead, the total damage amount came to just barely under 300 million, which is still pretty good. Though, again, I would personally save the NikkeGG comp for Alice because, you know. You can even try putting Snow White on the left or rightmost slot, as the angle in which the nuke is fired can sometimes catch more enemy parts versus if she's in the middle. Now that's some lateral thinking. You can see that there are many factors that force you to get creative with your strategies, whether it may be in team configurations, timings, and allies. I've only scratched the surface in this video, which is why I think Snow White is one of the most unique characters in the roster. Let's sum it up. Snow White is a unit that unleashes a devastating nuke that is able to one-shot most campaign levels or severely cripple certain bosses. While the idea of front-loading all your damage into one shot can be risky and hard to control, the ability to use off-meta allies and explore more of what Nikke's roster has to offer is, in my opinion, invaluable. If you go over to my Genshin channel, I don't actually rank characters based on how strong they are, but mostly on how many different teams they can be placed in with minimal changes to their builds. Snow White is like that, but in this game. If you're in the mood for a unique way to blast your way through the campaign or bosses, and don't mind being a little patient and getting creative with your strategies, Snow White might just be the one for you. Overall, she gets a 4 out of 5 rating from me. While it is a different way to play the game, having good investments and good handling on how she plays can make the numbers you deal comparable to meta teams. This was a long one, because there really wasn't that much information on Snow White, especially once updated for 2023. I certainly don't think the footage I provided showed the absolute best, but I hope I was able to at least pique your interest on this hungry pilgrim. I'm most likely gonna be taking a look at Red Hood, who will be releasing shortly, or have already released if I'm late with this video. Stay tuned for more Nikke content just like this one, and if you like what you see, you know what to do. Thank you for watching as always, and always remember, have fun with the game.